What do you think of our brand new
studio
set here? Yeah, it's pretty impressive, huh?
Yeah.
Describe to the listeners, where are we?
We are sitting in our new apartment closet.
BloodStream is a Belief original.
A 360-degree look
at the bleeding disorders community.
The developments, the history,
the news,
and the people who shape our world.
BloodStream is brought to you by
the National Hemophilia Foundation
and created by Believe Limited.
Happy listening.
Hello, and welcome to BloodStream, Episode 9, February 20th, 2017. I'm Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm Natalie DeLilla.
On this episode, and just weeks away from National Hemophilia Foundation's Washington Days, we'll take a look at what advocacy means for the bleeding disorders community and how you can participate. We'll also hear about the growingly popular cryotherapy. What is it, and is it safe and effective for people with joint and chronic pain? We'll hear a powerful anonymous story from a community mom on addiction, family, and hemophilia. And during the sit-down segment, I speak with former NHF board chair and current board member Jorge de la Riva about the duties of NHF's board, his family's personal story, and his views on bleeding disorders advocacy, especially in light of the 2016 election. All that and more coming up on this episode. Welcome to BloodStream. All right, how you doing today, Natalie?
I'm doing all right.
You excited to be back at doing the BloodStream thing?
Always, yeah. This is one of my favorite things to do with you.
What is your favorite part of this episode? What are you most looking forward to on this episode?
My part.
Oh my goodness. Spoken like a true talent. True member of talent on the call sheet. I want to thank everybody who has started to check out the 2 additional podcasts that BloodStream Media has launched. We released that special announcement episode last week, the Ask the Expert podcast, featuring HTC clinicians answering listener-submitted questions about all things bleeding disorders, and the Powering Through podcast, which brings to life the live panel conversations on obstacles and challenges that we hold around the country for the benefit of the bleeding disorders community. You can find both of those podcasts if you haven't already. If you go to bloodstreammedia.com, you'll see big ol' icons for our 3 podcasts and the appropriate links to listen, download, and subscribe to them. Thanks to those who have, and if you haven't, check them out. We're pretty proud of them, and they're a much different offering than what you get here on the BloodStream podcast. Speaking of BloodStream Media, I should clarify. Believe Limited's first podcast for the bleeding disorders community was this one, the BloodStream podcast. But as we have grown and we are now offering more podcasts, we're offering them under an umbrella of a podcast network. And the name of our network is BloodStream Media. So what that means is, as I mentioned, BloodStream Media is where you can just find everything. If you remember one website, that's the one, BloodStream Media. Likewise, our Facebook page is now known as the BloodStream Media page and can be found at facebook.com/BloodStream Media. Previously, it was BloodStream Pod. It is now BloodStream Media. The Twitter handle will stay the same, at BloodStream Info, and the email address, mailbag@BloodStreamMedia.com. You'll want to use that email address as well, mailbag@BloodStreamMedia.com. And we're asking for you to submit any questions that you may have for Ask the Expert, questions for an HTC clinician. Maybe you don't have your comp visit coming up for a little while, or there's a question you have that you don't necessarily want to ask to your particular HTC for any reason. That's fine. You can send it our way. You can ask it anonymously, and we will forward that on to our experts for that podcast. You can send those questions to mailbag@BloodStreamMedia.com. This podcast will remain unchanged. Natalie and I will continue to produce these once a month, and you can find links to the other podcasts and download them at bloodstreammedia.com. And finally, I want to thank everybody who has left us a review on iTunes. I know I've mentioned it pretty much on every episode. They do really help other people find the podcast. iTunes indexes things based on algorithms and blah, blah, blah. So the reviews do actually mean something. If you do have time and haven't left a review for the BloodStream podcast, Ask the Expert, or the Powering Through podcast, if you could check us out on iTunes and leave a little review, we would greatly appreciate it. And with that, let us get on to, Natalie?
Trending topics.
Looking for a new way to learn about hemophilia, von Willebrand disease, or just life with a bleeding disorder? Look no further. Stop the Bleeding is an award-winning comedic web series about bleeding disorders, centered around a dysfunctional nonprofit organization that serves the bleeding disorders community. Styled after the hit British and American sitcom The Office, the show uses humor and narrative storytelling to educate and empower people affected by bleeding disorders. Find all 29 episodes by visiting stbhemo.com. All right, our first trending topic story for today, BioMarin's investigational gene therapy treatment for people with severe hemophilia A, which is currently known as BMN 270, has been granted PRIME status by the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA, following analysis of the drug's phase 1-2 clinical trial data. So essentially, this PRIME designation from the EMA is given to investigational medicines that target a significant unmet need, and it comes with additional layers of support and an accelerated review by the EMA. Worth mentioning that BioMarin is looking to enroll patients in the next phase of clinical trials sometime this fall.
So what does that mean for patients here in the U.S.?
Good question. Nothing right now. We're still a ways away from the clinical trials concluding and for all that data to be reviewed. It's also worth emphasizing that this PRIME label and the additional support that it comes with from the EMA is from the EMA, not the FDA, which is essentially the equivalent body here in the United States. So that doesn't mean that BMN 270 couldn't theoretically be granted breakthrough status by the FDA, which is essentially the equivalent to the EMA's PRIME label, but that remains to be seen.
I see.
And speaking of the FDA and breakthrough status, uniQure's investigational hemophilia B gene therapy, AMT-060, was granted just that by the FDA only a few weeks ago.
And Patrick, can you just clarify, how does a drug receive breakthrough status from the FDA or PRIME status from the EMA?
So the EMA includes a committee called the Committee for Medicinal Products for Human Use, which amusingly is acronymed as CHMP, or CHIMP. I don't know if people actually call it CHIMP, but that's how I'm going to remember it. So CHIMP, on behalf of the EMA, determines if an investigational medicine, which, by the way, is just a formal way of saying a drug being developed. If an investigational medicine's early clinical data, which is usually phase 1 or phase 1 and 2 clinical data, suggests that the medicine has the potential to meet a great unmet need.
And what about the FDA and breakthrough status? Is it a similar process? And how does a drug get breakthrough status? Does the drug maker apply for it, or is it something the FDA just determines based on data? Great
questions. So, yes, the FDA's process for determining breakthrough status does appear, as best I can tell, to be comparable to the EMA and CHIMP status. Thank you for the pity laughs. And the EMA's process for determining PRIME status. I think that's fair to say that they're comparable. And with regard to how breakthrough status is granted, drug makers do submit a request for breakthrough status if they believe their investigational product, again, just a drug being developed, has the promise of meeting a strong unmet need. And for context, I did a little Googling, and it appears that in 2016, the FDA received a total, and this is a total, not just a hemophilia or bleeding disorders total, of 129 requests for breakthrough status on investigational drugs. And of those 129 requests, 54 were granted breakthrough status.
So that's about half. Is that a lot or considered a little?
Your guess is as good as mine there, Curious George. We have exhausted the extent of my knowledge on the inner workings of the FDA.
All right, that's fair.
But one last point on uniQure's breakthrough status. And if you're wondering why we're spending so much time on these two drug updates, it's because, according to analytics, both of these stories were amongst the most widely, this one and the previous one about drug being developed, were amongst the most widely shared in the community over the past several weeks. So it felt to us like we should spend a little time on these and talk a bit about the FDA and the EMA and how these statuses come about, what they actually mean. And that leads me to one final point, which is that while uniQure's product has been granted this status, the clinical trials are not even set to be completed until December of 2020. So, and we have said this before a few times on BloodStream, while there is reason for excitement, there is also reason to keep that excitement reasonably tempered.
Ready for our next trending topic?
I am ready for the next one. What do you got?
According to an article published in Hemophilia News Today, a team of Chinese researchers found that daily infusions of low-dose factor VIII improves trough levels in patients with severe hemophilia A, compared to infusions that are performed every other day, which, if I'm understanding this correctly, is an argument for a daily infusion regimen over an every other day regimen. Is that right?
Yeah, well, see, I'm a little confused by this study and article too, but again, like the previous two stories, it was getting a lot of traction online, so we felt it was important to bring it up. Without getting too into the weeds on this study, because in my opinion it is not of the greatest consequence, the article states that the study suggests that low-dose daily prophylaxis can increase trough levels without needing to increase the amount of factor consumed as compared to an every other day regimen.
Remind us what a trough level is.
Right. Okay, so layman's
Or what a trough is?
Yeah. Okay. Layman's definition. Soon after you infuse factor, either recombinant, plasma-derived, doesn't matter, your body has its highest percentage of factor metabolized and actively working in your system. That highest point, that's your peak. On the flip side, factor has a half-life, and once you hit peak, with every hour that passes, less and less factor is actively operating inside your body. So prior to the next infusion, when you reach the lowest amount of factor in your system, the basement, as it were, that's your trough.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this study is making the point, a point that admittedly does require confirmation from additional studies. There aren't other studies that confirm this, which is significant when you get into the world of studies and such. This study is making the point that a low-dose daily regimen does more to boost the troughs, the low levels, than a more traditional full-dose every other day regimen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So should people be infusing every day?
Well, no, they shouldn't. And this is where it gets confusing. As we look at extended half-life products on the market now, and these non-factor products that can be taken once a week or once every 2 weeks that don't require intravenous access, that's the direction that therapies are moving, not into regimens that require more infusions as opposed to less. Now, from where I sit, what does make this study's data compelling is if we think about the developing world or parts of the globe with limited access to product. And it's not lost on me that this was a study conducted by Chinese researchers. If additional research supports the claim that putting a patient on low-dose daily prophylaxis actually results in less bleeds than an every other day regimen of an even greater quantity of factor,
I see where you're going.
then I can see how this piece of information has clinical and practical significance. But for those of us in the U.S., as best I can tell, this is relatively non-significant.
Relatively non-significant. That sounds so fancy.
Thank you. Bioverativ or Bioverativ, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. Tried to look up a video where it was said, couldn't find one, so we'll go with Bioverativ. Is now the official spin-off company containing Biogen's hemophilia business. So this isn't too dissimilar from just a few years ago when Baxter's hemophilia business was spun off into its own company called Baxalta, which has since been acquired by Shire.
Should patients taking a Lactate or a Prolix have any cause for concern?
No, it's hard to imagine that this business move would negatively impact the actual patient experience with those products or the services that are provided in tandem with them. In fact, it stands to reason that a new company, which is specifically built around precisely those products and services, would have every intention of maintaining and growing them.
So, Patrick, we're running a little long on this section, but I know there were a couple other topics you wanted to hit on quickly.
Yeah, okay, so lightning round style, 3 things. Lori Kelly Communications. We've talked about Lori Kelly before. She is the founder of Save One Life. She's also the founder of Kelly Communications, LA Kelly Communications, who years ago were really one of the only entities that were putting out educational material for parents, including a book that's pretty well known in the parent community if you're above the age of, say, 40, 45, Raising a Child with Hemophilia. Very, very well-known book in our community by Lori Kelly. There's a new edition of it coming out, and you can find all of the programs and publications and books that are produced by Lori Kelly by visiting kellycom.com. That's KELLEYCOM.com, and we'll have links in the program notes as well. 2 quick updates from HFA. HFA has a 2017 Policy and Government Relations internship has opened up. If you are interested in bleeding disorders, advocacy, public policy, how these things get hashed out, how does change actually happen, take a look at the specs connected to this internship. We have, again, links in the program notes. You can also dig around on HFA's website, hemophiliafed.org, to find it as well. And also from HFA, a new and improved Blood Brotherhood for him. The Blood Brotherhood program from HFA is really a backbone piece for a lot of adult men in this community. I have been a part of the Blood Brotherhood for the last number of years and sat in on those rap sessions and have made great bonds with those guys. Admittedly, on HFA's part, the forum was in need of some significant facelifting and some modernizing, and they've gone ahead and done that recently. So take a look. If you are an adult man living with a bleeding disorder, take a look at the new and improved Blood Brotherhood forum from HFA. Again, links in the program notes for this episode. And finally, it's not really a trending topic, it's just me wanting to say we'd like to do some more programming aimed at the rare factor and rare platelet disorder part of our population. As you know, in our like, share, comment segment, which is coming up just in a minute, Last month, we featured Delisa O'Brien, who's living with sickle cell disease. We have a story this month from a mom who talks about addiction as well as family and hemophilia. That's coming up in just a moment. Very powerful story. And each month, we want to put a community spotlight somewhere that perhaps isn't getting enough attention. And I think the rare factor and rare platelet disorder peeps in our community are amongst those who qualify for not getting enough attention. So if you or someone you know has a rare factor or rare platelet disorder and you would like to submit a story of your experience to BloodStream, send it our way. mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You're also welcome to contact us through Twitter @BloodStreamInfo, on Facebook, facebook.com/BloodStreamMedia. We want to hear from you.
Up ahead in our Like, Share, Comment segment, we'll discuss Washington Days, the major upcoming advocacy event in D.C. We'll take a look at the increasingly popular cryotherapy. What is it, and is it safe and effective for people with chronic pain and joint problems? We'll hear a very personal and honest story about addiction, family, and bleeding disorders from a community mom. Plus, Patrick speaks with NHF board member Jorge de la Riva during our sit-down segment. All that and more after a word from one of our sponsors.
Shire's enduring commitment to the bleeding disorders community started over 60 years ago. This deep-rooted focus on research and innovation resulted in the first commercially available recombinant factor VIII treatment, the first recombinant factor VIII treatment free of blood-based additives, and the first recombinant treatment for adults with von Willebrand disease. Shire is passionate about people with bleeding disorders. Shire's vision is to empower you to live life your way. Learn more at bleedingdisorders.com. All right, to kick off our Like, Share, Comment segment for the month, Natalie is going to present our story on cryotherapy. Take it away, Natalie.
On February 6th, Travel and Leisure published an article on what it's like to experience cryotherapy. You may be thinking, what the heck is cryotherapy?
Mm-hmm.
But after you hear the myriad of potential benefits, you'll be Googling cryotherapy in your area. Cryotherapy is a liquid nitrogen tank, and it creates an environment of very low temperatures.
How low?
Negative 166 degrees Fahrenheit to negative 222 degrees Fahrenheit.
Whoa, yeah. That's really cold.
It's really, really cold. It's used to treat symptoms of arthritis, tissue damage, and inflammation. And then it also has these amazing claims to cure jet lag, increase energy, increase cell rejuvenation, improve skin tone, and reduce the signs of aging. Oh, and also, you burn up to 800 calories in the next few hours after you leave your session.
Wow, it sounds like a fountain of youth. It sounds like as a cold tunnel of youth being shot at you at a very, very freezing cold temperature. So, but how does it work? Walk us through a session. What's the experience like?
Okay, so I actually went last week. I liked it so much I went back a second time. The sessions are very short, 3 minutes to be exact. You walk in, strip down to your skivvies. They give you socks and gloves to wear so that you don't get frostbite on your fingers and toes.
That's good.
Yeah, safety first. Climb into the chamber, and the technician joins you in the room to run your session. Your head is outside of the chamber the entire time, and so you can chat with your technician for those 3 minutes while you're freezing.
Did you chat with your technician for those 3 minutes while you were freezing? What do you
Yes.
talk about when you're like just being I feel like I would just be like, it's cold, it's very cold. How does it get less cold? Like, what did you talk about?
I mean, he asked me how my weekend was.
Yeah, I've noticed actually when I was getting my blood drawn at the HTC, and they were like, so what's going on with you? And it's like, oh, distraction technique. Very clever.
Yeah.
Very, very clever. Okay, and then what happens? Can you, if it's too cold for you?
Oh, you can step out at any point. So the sessions are 3 minutes, but if this is too much for you, you can just step out of the chamber.
Did you make the full 3 minutes both times?
Well, I have to say I'm a freeze baby, and I was very anxious before the session. But the session itself, while cold, was totally doable.
And did you experience any of those benefits that you mentioned earlier?
I walked into the session with a very tight lower back that had been bothering me for weeks, and a couple hours after my session, I felt noticeable relief in my lower back.
That's great.
Yeah, it was awesome.
So this does sound like the kind of thing that would be a really good option for people with bleeding disorders or who are experiencing symptoms of arthritis, tissue damage, and inflammation, right?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So one of the things I did talk to my technician about when I was in the chamber to pass the 3 minutes was cryotherapy and bleeding disorders. He seemed to think that there'd be no adverse effects, but with any kind of therapy, recommended that you consult your physician and your care team before beginning.
It's yeah, of course. We don't want you thinking whatever we say here on BloodStream it's not medical information. It's just information to hopefully get you interested in doing a little more investigating. And correct me if I'm wrong, Natalie, but did you mention to me at some point that technician was also the owner of the company? So this is somebody who knows a lot about cryotherapy.
Yeah, he was the owner of where I went here in California, so he knows what he's talking about.
Good source of information. Well, I will say for one, my interest officially peaked.
Cool, because I signed you up for next week.
Oh, look at you. And now for our share piece, which was submitted anonymously by a community mom and covers a very personal, very powerful story on addiction, hemophilia, and family. You're going to hear it in just a moment, read by a voiceover actor. So this is not the individual who submitted the story. This is an actor who's reading the story. I'll leave it at that, and Natalie and I will be back on the other side to underscore a few takeaways from this story. Here it is.
Addiction is not unfamiliar to me. I have been in recovery in Narcotics Anonymous, NA, for decades. My own story is one that I have told many times. I was clean for a couple of years when I had my son. When I found out he had hemophilia, it was my recovery in NA that helped me keep moving forward and gave me the courage to keep trying, even when I felt overwhelmed and scared. The story I've not told is the story of my son and how the disease of hemophilia and the pain involved led him down the path to the disease of addiction. For the purposes of this story, I'll call him Jason, though that's not his real name. Like so many children with a bleeding disorder, it wasn't uncommon for Jason to be given narcotic pain medication before he was old enough to go to school. Jason was born before prophylaxis was the standard of care, so he experienced ankle, knee, and hip bleeds frequently when he was just a toddler. By 2 years old, he had been given low-dose Percocet combinations twice. By the time he was put on a prophylaxis regimen, he had been given the combination several times. There's no way to say if that opened the door to addiction for him or made him more likely to become an addict. Some would say a child born to 2 addict parents, even ones in recovery, is more likely to use. I think about this often, but I know if I spend too much time analyzing that possibility, I'd make myself crazy. In adolescence, he was experiencing severe hip and ankle pain. He was given more narcotic pain meds. At 15 or 16, he was prescribed 5 milligrams of timed-release morphine in the morning for his chronic pain. At 18, the intake was upped to twice a day. Soon after, the dose was doubled to 10 milligrams twice a day. At 19, he was prescribed the added prize of Dilaudid for breakthrough bleeds. He also had his ankle fused that year because he had developed such bad osteoarthritis in the joint that walking was constant pain. I know now that for him it meant more drugs, not less pain. I suppose in my heart I knew it then, but whenever faced with his pain, I was like an active addict myself. I could not stop trying to make it better for him. He had gotten so good at going to the ER and walking out with a narcotic script, he could have written a guidebook. That spring, after the ankle fusion, was when he told me he had been using street drugs. This child had literally been raised in the rooms of NA. He was 2 days old at his first meeting. His dad had been in jail and eventually died from the disease. He had been to meetings, conventions, campouts, and dances. He knew more about addiction and recovery than many professionals. My heart was broken. It wasn't so much surprise that I felt, it was disappointment, both in him and in myself. With all the knowledge he had and the pain he had experienced with his father's disease, how could he let it get so out of hand? Then there was my own shame of knowing that in my efforts to make his life pain-free, I had supported and encouraged his addiction. Detoxes and recovery houses wouldn't take him because of the hemophilia. Even our local ER wouldn't help. The disease and the fact that he came with needles meant he was too much of a risk. I finally found a 28-day program in the Midwest to take him. 28 days later, I picked him up from the airport and brought him home. He was high within 4 hours. After a couple more detoxes and rehabs in Florida, I finally surrendered. I knew that he couldn't be home anymore. He was stealing from my aging mother whom we lived with. In my own recovery, I had advised people over and over to let their addict go. I had to finally really come to terms with the fact that my own son might die from addiction before I could cut him loose. We went off to another national event, and that was when I told him he couldn't come home with me. I put him on a plane to Florida with a tentative plan and contacts at a recovery house. I flew home alone. I didn't see my son for 7 months. I talked with him occasionally, and time and again he would go into another recovery house and get kicked out. I would get the dreaded phone call that he was asked to leave yet another facility and begin the process of prayer and acceptance all over again. It was a daily struggle to carry on with my own life, knowing that at any time his could end. I was something of a hollow shell in my everyday existence. I went to work, but often found myself weeping in hallways or bathrooms. Each time a friend talked about their child's accomplishments, my own feelings of inadequacy compounded. I went to bleeding disorder events pretending Jason was in Florida starting a new life, when in reality, I often didn't even know where he was or if he was alive. I was going to another event in Florida when he called and asked me if he could come to see me. I arranged to get him to where I was. When I saw him walking towards me for the first time in months, I looked at him and I knew that he was going to die if he continued on. He asked to come home and offered me solutions for getting himself help. We reached an agreement. He had to follow through or I would send him away again. I knew this time that I would be able to do it. I'd come to terms with his addiction and the possibility of his death. I got him on a plane home, and he began the process of getting off street drugs. It's been a few years now. He's not doing things my way, but he is doing it. He still struggles with pain management, and I find that even though I have years in recovery, I am willing to back him on his decision to use marijuana to ease the pain of hemophilia and the call of addiction. I suppose I see it as a way to keep him alive. If he's taking marijuana instead of the street drugs that were killing him, at least I know he won't die. I also suppose this may be purely a justification. I'm not sure I can do battle with what we went through before, and if marijuana helps us avoid that battle, I'll take it. Through his lowest and highest points, the one thing that stayed true in his life was the love of the bleeding disorders community. He always fulfilled his commitments, even when he was sick or struggling with addiction. I know in my heart that the reason he stayed alive for much of the time he was using was because of the love of his blood brothers and the ability to help other kids younger than him. I never talk much about this challenge in the bleeding disorders community. I know the taboos are still alive and well, even though so many people struggle with addictions caused by pain medications. It feels taboo to talk openly about marijuana, even in 2017. It feels taboo to talk about how the very medicine that helps many of us cope can also kill us or lead us to addiction and other challenges. Why? Why don't we talk about these things? My desire to shout at people who okay the use of narcotics on their young kids is always present, but how do I tell them without being able to tell them why? I can't even tell people that I'll be here to talk to them if they're going through what I've gone through, because it will blow my own and my child's anonymity. That's why I wanted to share this with you. With you. I want us to talk about these things openly. I want us to look for better, safer ways to treat our pain. I want us all to know we're not alone. I want you to know you are not alone.
Okay, and that is the share piece for this month. Thank you very much to the individual who submitted that story. You know who you are, and we appreciate your contribution. Natalie, what stood out for you in that story?
It was powerful, honest, and raw. What stood out to me was that it was a story of many struggles. Her initial struggle, and then finding out her son had hemophilia, and then finding out he was addicted to painkillers. I mean, that's three very, one of those alone is a story, a lifetime arc of, something to go through, let alone three peaks of challenges.
Well, and that gets to a good point, which is we talk about hemophilia, von Willebrand disease, bleeding disorders challenges, but no one's life is so simple that they're only dealing with challenges under one umbrella. Life's complicated, and people have different factors, no pun intended, that are influencing their life experience. And sometimes two of those things combined can have a synergistic effect in a negative way, or a compounding effect in a negative or unfortunate way. That definitely stood out to me too. I'm very thankful that this story is so personal, and I hear the point being made of we need to talk about these things. We need to talk about the uncomfortable things. It's an uncomfortable story. Addiction and a young person battling, hearing a parent come to terms with the possibility of their son's death. I mean, that's a very unfortunate thought to have to own. But it's a real one, and I appreciate this individual taking a leadership role in putting a story like this out there and encouraging people who feel this way to identify and recognize that they are not alone and that the struggles with addiction exist everywhere and to a heightened degree within our community. I do want to also make the point that addiction and hemophilia don't go hand in hand. So for any new parents out there who may be listening, or for people who feel as though they don't quite relate, it's not as though everybody who has a bleeding disorder or has chronic pain has an addiction to narcotics, pain medication, is gatewayed into using street drugs. But it does happen, and it's important that we talk about it. But I did just kind of want to make that point clear, that it's not necessarily ubiquitous, but it is more common than we would like to think, and more common than we sometimes give weight to, or more common than we discuss.
Or that it's spoken about, actually.
Exactly.
And it's important to talk about because it is uncomfortable, and it's what people don't want to talk about. So I think it needs to be brought to light.
I agree. And thank you again to the mom who sent this story in. And finally, our comment piece is all about advocacy. So as we have mentioned numerous times, NHF's Washington Days is coming up in just a few weeks in the beginning of March, but advocacy isn't something that you solely need to wait for one day a year in the calendar to participate in. But rather than give you my inevitably long-winded thoughts and opinions on how you can go about being an advocate, I'd like to read from something that the National Hemophilia Foundation published on January 24th, and it's titled, How to Advocate to Protect Access to Health Insurance. So I'm just going to read some pieces from that, kind of underscore things that I think might be worth particularly paying attention to, and then I'll give you a couple of links that you can look at. You can click on them in the program notes for additional resources. So what to say? This is something people get hung up on a lot. They want to advocate, they want to get involved, but they literally don't know what words to use, how to put them together, how to form the sentences. It can be intimidating. So here are NHF's recommendations. Introduce yourself and say that you are a constituent who lives in the member's state or district. This is talking to a member of your either state or federal representation, someone who is either a member of the state senate, your state senator in Congress, or your House representative. Introduce yourself, say you're a constituent who lives in that member's state or district. Explain that you or a loved one is affected by hemophilia or von Willebrand disease or whatever the bleeding disorder is that's brought you to the office that day. Let them know that you are concerned about the repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act because bleeding disorders are expensive chronic conditions and that our community needs access to high-quality, affordable health insurance. Mention policies that matter to your family, such as the elimination of pre-existing condition exclusions, the elimination of lifetime caps, limits on out-of-pocket expenses, ability for young adults to stay on parents' insurance plans until 26, and network adequacy policies that ensure access to hemophilia treatment centers. And it's worthwhile to include specific details about how these policies have affected your life or a family member's life. It's always important to remember that these individuals are human beings. So while it's useful to point out aspects of policy and be able to cite different parts of the bill, let them know that you are educated on the topic, it's also valuable to demonstrate through a personal story how these things have actually impacted your life. And finally, ask that member to support the policies that ensure individuals with expensive chronic conditions can access adequate health insurance. So if we just quickly capsule what to say: who are you? Where do you live? Because that's relative to the individual you'll be speaking with. Identify how you are affected by a bleeding disorder. What do you have, or what does your loved one have? Let them know your concerns about health insurance and the repeal and replacement of the Affordable Care Act. Point out the policy aspects that perhaps you think are particularly significant. For example, the elimination of the pre-existing conditions exclusions. That's a huge one. The elimination of lifetime caps. That's a huge one for us. Don't forget to make it personal. Tell a story that captures what you're trying to say in a very personal way. And finally, explicitly ask that member to support whatever the policy is that you're there to speak about. Don't be shy. Those individuals work for you. So don't be shy about asking them to support the things that you believe are most important. So what are the ways that you can advocate outside of group-organized efforts such as Washington Days or your State Hill Days? Well, there's 3 ways. 1, you could call your member of Congress. You don't even need to know their phone number. If you call the Capitol switchboard at 202-224-3121 and give your state or address, you will be connected to your representative or senator's office. Once you reach a staff person or a voicemail, tell your story and go through it. You can email your member of Congress. If you visit your representative or senator's website, you'll find a contact form or a contact us page. You can also go to house.gov or senate.gov to search there for your representative's email addresses. Many of them also have social media accounts, so a quick Google search of your representative will also most likely link you to something that's a click or 2 away from finding their email address, and you can email them your story. Finally, you can tell NHF your story. NHF is currently collecting stories from all around the community to aggregate our advocacy efforts. So if you would prefer to submit your story to NHF and let them go do that beckoning, email advocate@hemophilia.org. That's advocate@hemophilia.org. There will also be links in the program notes. Or you can go to NHF's website, hemophilia.org, and look for the Share Your Story campaign article and send your story to NHF. So you can make a phone call, you can shoot over an email, or you can tell NHF. There are many ways to advocate. The most important thing is that you pick one of them.
So coming up next is our sit-down segment. Who are we sitting down with today?
Today we're sitting down with Jorge de la Riva. He's a board member at the National Hemophilia Foundation.
What are you guys talking about?
We're going to talk about advocacy. We're going to talk about his family's personal story of coming to the U.S. and living with hemophilia. And we're also going to talk about how NHF's board works.
Well, that sounds very exciting.
You don't sound very excited.
I am excited.
Can I hear it a little more?
I'm excited!
Thank you. My conversation with Jorge coming up next. Attending summer camp or family camp is a time to meet new friends, to get out of your comfort zone and try new things. And for many people with hemophilia, it's where you first learn to self-infuse. Camp is a big deal in the bleeding disorders community, which is why Season 6 of Stop the Bleeding takes place entirely at a fictional camp for people with bleeding disorders called Camp I Don't Wanna Bleed. Throughout the 8-episode season, the show touches upon themes like inclusion versus isolation, the importance of challenge by choice, and the growing awareness of women with bleeding disorders and their unique needs. You can watch the 8-episode season right now by going to stbhemo.com. Thank you, Jorge, for agreeing to do this with me.
Well, thank you, Patrick, for asking me. It's my pleasure.
People may know you from your role with the National Hemophilia Foundation. You are the past board chair. You are a current board member. I'm wondering if you can give people some insight. What goes on the NHF board? What role do board members have? How do they help NHF find its way forward, make big decisions about important issues? If you could give us a little insight as a board member, what does the NHF board do?
NHF, our board, has chosen a governance model for running how we do things at the board. That means that we provide policy, broad goals, and we allow our staff, our CEO, to determine the ways in which he thinks is best to accomplish those goals, not interfering in the day-to-day running of the operation, in such a way that often people will call us with ideas and ask us to do specific things, but that is not what our board of directors does. We are focused on the policies, the governance, on limits, and on making sure things are done well, and on providing goals that are ambitious for our agency to accomplish.
And I'm sure there are plenty of things that are in confidence, and I want to respect that. So I state that before asking you, can you give us some either examples or a very practical sense of how the way this governance model board operates, what that might look like, or can you point to something that we would recognize in the community and say, well, yeah, this is how the board helped shepherd that thing into life?
Yes, it is the director's responsibility to make sure that everything that the agency does is with a view of accomplishing the mission in such a way that in the last couple of years, our board has been focused on determining broad strategic priorities for the next several years. And we have come up with a few strong priorities that include driving the pace of research, which we find is important for every single member of our community to make sure that our agency, because it's ours, anybody that has a bleeding disorder is the owner of the National Hemophilia Foundation. And we know from talking to people and from our own beliefs that participation in research is very important for our community. We also know, and particularly in this environment, that advocacy is terribly important, access to care. So that is another one of our strategic priorities, diversification of revenues. And that is a responsibility that belongs not just with our staff, but with every single member of our community. And we can affect that by showing up at our walks, by participating, by raising funds, by making contributions. Every little contribution adds to a big stream, and together we make a difference.
And when did you start on the board, Jorge?
I've been on the board of directors for 7 years. I have been finance chair. I have been vice chair, board chair. Now I'm back to vice chair. As I've said, it doesn't matter where I am. Every board member has just as strong of a voice, and there are 14 of us currently, and we work together in a very collegial and highly focused manner.
All right, well, I can't help but ask this question. Of the different hats that you've worn on the board, what has been your favorite or fit you best, and what has been, to put it positively, the most challenging for you?
Well, I think without question, wanted to be somebody to rally our community to get involved, to make sure that we have in our sights that whatever happens or doesn't happen is because we made it happen. We as a community came together to drive what we are concerned about, to make things happen for ourselves. At some point, we as members of this community or as citizens have to realize that it is never up to anybody else. It is not up to our governors or to our president or to our senators or congressmen. It is up to us. What we want to happen happens, but we have to drive it. And so being an advocate and trying to rally our community to step up and being involved, I think, has been the role that I most treasure in my time working for NHF. The most difficult one, always, raising funds. It is never fun to ask people for money. It is never fun to reach inside your own pocket. But that is how we make things happen.
So that kind of begs an interesting question. There's a decent amount of people who listen to this podcast on the chapter level, executive directors, board members, chapter activists. Is there anything that you have learned about fundraising? Because that seems to be something that's challenging for everyone who works for a nonprofit organization of any size. Are there any tips that you've picked up in the last 7 years that would be worth sharing for people on the regional side of things?
First, I have to say that I have the highest respect for the work that chapters do, executive directors and board members and volunteers. Those are the trenches. Those are where things happen. And it's a thankless task often, and it's very common to see the same people year after year after year doing the hard work. The only thing I could say is that when raising money, first principle is to ask, knock on the door, to make the call. Some people will say yes, some people will say no, but if we do not take the initiative, nothing will come of it.
Yeah, sometimes I think just the intimidation level stops a lot of people from getting started in the first place. I know I've been in that position, so I can identify with that for sure. So I want to go back 7 years ago before you joined the board. You've got an interesting story. Your family has an interesting story, and I know you've shared at least parts of it before at annual meeting or at other public events, but just wondering if you could take a few minutes to kind of share your family's interesting story and how it landed you ultimately in Texas and where you are today, where you and your family are today.
My family emigrated from Mexico in 1980 when my father was transferred to run an engineering company. And a year later, he was diagnosed with brain cancer and died a few months later. At that time, I was 18 years old and had 6 younger siblings, and we had run out of money fighting that cancer. So we decided to stay and make a life in the United States and fight and survive and flourish. And life has shown us, all my siblings and myself, that when you make an effort, when you pull yourself up by the proverbial bootstraps, good results follow.
So take us to that 18-year-old with 6 younger siblings. What was going through your mind? What kind of conversations are you and your mom having? What are you weighing? It just feels like that's a time that must have been kind of fraught with considerations and mixed emotions and fear and all kinds of things. How did you process all of that? And what were some of the highlights that you could share with us from that time?
Absolutely. It was sheer survival. My brothers and me started working at that age in any job we could possibly get, from working at the mall for my brothers to selling vacuum cleaners door to door for myself, in a great variety of different jobs. I used to be a weather broadcaster in the early hours of the morning in the Spanish-speaking radio station.
I'm sorry, I have to pause you right there. You did the weather for can you give us an example of what Jorge de la Riva's weather report used to sound like?
I'm afraid it would be awful, but I can tell you that involved getting up every day at 3 a.m., getting the feed from AccuWeather, translating it, sending it off. At that time, we had to send it off to Washington, D.C., because one of the forecasts was over Radio Free Cuba, and then they would send it back to us approved, and then we would tape it and send it on. It didn't pay very much, but it always made for a great story.
Yeah, I'll say.
And it always seemed to be semi-cloudy with a chance of rain.
No matter what.
No matter what.
Semi-anything with a chance of something else is a pretty great way to keep yourself from getting in trouble. Keeps it good and broad. It sounds like you learned during that time, like you said, it was all about survival, getting up at 3 a.m, selling vacuum cleaners, whatever it took. How did that influence the way that you then went on to become a young professional, to become a family man, to become a community leader? Can you connect the dots from that time to where you are today?
I guess from the time I was a kid, nobody told me that such a thing as impossible existed. And as a young man facing what seemed like an impossible situation, my siblings and myself learned that we could go through impossible. And that was very helpful years later when we were first confronted with the very scary hemophilia diagnosis. That has been helpful in my life as a small entrepreneur making my way through life. I never think there's anything impossible, and that's why I'm such a big proponent, and have been for so many years, for us doing everything we can to go after the cure for every type of bleeding disorders.
When you first found out about your son's diagnosis, did you have any family history? Was your son the first, or what was that experience like?
My son was the first indeed. We had no family history. We didn't know anything about hemophilia, but we had read in the newspapers. And at the time, in the early 90s, what we had read in the newspapers was not good. It was very scary. In fact, after he was born and diagnosed, the first few days, I thought he would die. We would carry him in a pillow around the house because we were afraid to hurt him. We were, scared every day. And we were not able to breathe again until we saw other children who had hemophilia and still played and went to school. And then we saw adults. And that made us regain our sense of normalcy. And even though hemophilia has been an amazing struggle, and as you know, Patrick, no cakewalk, it's a part of someone's life, and you can make a very nice life while fighting hemophilia.
When did you first meet another family who was affected by hemophilia?
About a week after my son came home. 2 families that had sons with severe hemophilia that lived in a very subdivision, and I remember their faces and the sound of their voices. Great families. And I've seen through the years how families in our community do that for each other. When somebody has a child and he's diagnosed and we hear about it, we immediately embrace those families as we were embraced when we were first going through that.
Did your son's diagnosis, and your son's also Jorge, as I know, so I can use his name as well. Did Jorge's diagnosis influence you and your wife's decision on future kids? I know that's something that came up for my mother when there's not a family history and it's not expected. Sometimes that greatly impacts the conversation between the parents. Was that the case for you and your wife?
No, we had already an almost 2-year-old daughter, and our life plan was to have 2 kids, so that did not affect whether we had more kids or not. But we have met many families that were concerned about that and took the plunge and had another kid, and I've never met anybody who regretted that.
So what then in your journey from Jorge's birth and your developing as a professional and as a family man, at what point did you decide I want to have a leadership role in this community and I want to do more to have an impact on this community?
I have to say that I started doing that out of shame because it was my wife who first did that, and she started volunteering for the chapter in Houston. And then after a while, she joined the board of directors. And then after a while, she was in the leadership role in the board of directors. And then they hired her as the executive director, and she was in that role for around 10 years, in which time she affected hundreds of lives in a positive way. And I've always saw that with great admiration and tried to keep up with what she always did. And after a while, I did more volunteering work. And one day I was asked whether I was interested in running for the board of directors at NHF, and I jumped at it. Funny thing is, the first time I submitted my name, I was not elected. But the board that year needed more members that had been elected, so they asked me to come up anyway. And then on the next round of elections, I was elected, and I have been on the board since then.
We hear often enough from chapters and also from NHF and HFA, the needs assessments come back identifying that Spanish-speaking members of our community in the States, they have substandard health outcomes, and there are studies that support that statement that we need to do more to engage with the Spanish-speaking American bleeding disorders population. So as someone for whom English is a second language, who immigrated into the country, who can, I'm sure, understand the needs of, at least on the Mexican-American side of things, the needs of the population better than most who speak about it, what progress have we made? And let's say in the last 7 years, since you've been on the board, I'm sure it's something that's been on your radar. What progress have we made, and where are we still deficient? What steps do we have to take to raise the bar on what we as a community are doing for that pocket of us?
We have made remarkable progress over the years. Even though we have made that progress, that's still one of the most vulnerable segments of our population, particularly those who are undocumented workers. And there are many families with hemophilia who are in this situation that have a very, very difficult time having access to care. For the rest of the Spanish-speaking community, for years and years, they were less likely to show up at chapter events because I suppose they didn't think that they had anything to contribute. And I remember visiting some of these families with my wife 20 years ago with their little babies, families that didn't think that they had anything to contribute. And today, and I get broken up. Today, I see them sitting on the chapter board and going to Austin days and advocating for their kids. And it's just a thing of beauty what happens when people embrace the community and step up. And we are such a diverse group of people where if we are always doing things for each other. I always remember a young Vietnamese lady who came to the chapter meetings, and she didn't speak English very much, but she tried to make herself understood, and she had her kids with her, and somehow this lady put her kids through college, and they are now in positions of leadership and just fantastic human beings.
For over 60 years, Shire has been committed to improving the lives and health of people with bleeding disorders through partnering with the community and leading investments in research. They offer a vast array of live event programs and resources, many of which are available in both English and Spanish. Shire is passionate about people with bleeding disorders. Shire's vision is to empower you to live life your way. To learn more and find a live event near you, visit bleedingdisorders.com. You know, we've chatted privately about our outlook on American society today and the aftermath of a very unexpected election, its impact on not just the ACA, but other things that affect our community. You know, it's my personal viewpoint that bleeding disorders don't discriminate. Bleeding disorders affect men and women. They affect people of all ages. They affect people of all races. They affect people of all backgrounds. They affect people of all economic standing. So there is a great melting pot that we belong to as members of the bleeding disorders community. And as a result of that, I am worried about where our country might be headed with some of our social governances. So I'm curious to know from your perspective, again, given your background and who you are in the world, without making this a political statement, because I was interested in something you said earlier about how it's not up to our Congress people, it's not up to the president, it's up to us. I guess I'm looking for you to go a little further with that and maybe even give me some comfort that we have maybe more power than we think. So there's not really a question in there. I'm just kind of setting a table for you, and I'd be curious to hear what your response to all that is.
I, like you, am highly concerned about many of the things that we see beginning to happen, changes in our society that are not necessarily going in the direction that I would hope. I see vulnerable populations in very difficult places, particularly immigrants and refugees and people with pre-existing conditions, which is something that affects our community. This is a time when we must all come together and we must step forward and we must come together. We can't afford to go in 1,000 different directions. We have to consolidate our efforts and laser focus our time and energy on the things that are most important to our life, like lifetime caps and pre-existing conditions, exclusions, and the Affordable Care Act. Yes, today there's 100 things that I'm worried about. And at the same time, I know that there are people with a different philosophy, with different politics, and that doesn't make them bad and that doesn't make them less intelligent. They just have a different philosophy. And if we want to be heard, we have to listen to them as well. But in the bleeding disorders community, like no time in many, many years, we have to come together. We have to talk to our chapters. We have to talk to the National Hemophilia Foundation. We'll have to talk to the Hemophilia Federation. We have to ask them for talking points. And then we have to make our voice heard. Sometimes it's difficult to conceive of picking up the telephone and calling your senator or your congressman or your mayor or any of your elected representatives. But it's not that difficult. And your chapter will help you. NHF will help you. Write down what you want to say. Practice it. Share of yourself when you call. And then call and call and call every day. I've started now 3 weeks ago calling my congressman every day. And now their staff know who I am. They know I'm going to be talking about the Affordable Care Act for a couple of minutes. They know my name. And so I know when we go to Washington days, they'll smile and they'll say, oh, this guy again. But that is the only way in which they're going to remember how much this matters to us, how our lives are on the line. And we will win some battles and we will lose some other battles. And when we lose them, then we just get up and we fight them again and again until we win them for good. This is not going to be fast. We can't expect to have everything we want today. But we have to fight the good battle.
There's a lot in there that jumped out at me, but something that I hear a lot, I'm sure you do too, is that call for coming together. Coming together seems to be an oft-repeated phrase from people when it comes to activism. What I appreciate, though, is that you just kind of defined that as well, consolidating our priorities and our efforts, and I guess perhaps triaging some of the things that we feel are important but maybe aren't top of mind or most vital. You highlighted two components of the ACA that we often talk about in the bleeding disorders community as being of particular importance to us: the elimination of lifetime caps and the legislation that no longer allowed insurance companies to discriminate based on pre-existing condition. And maybe we need to focus more specifically on components of things that feel important and try to win those battles first. So I appreciated your defining what coming together means a bit in there. And I want to bring up, I saw pictures from, I believe it was the Women's March, and I'm guessing in Houston, where you live, with you and your daughter, who's active in the bleeding disorders community, active, it looks like, as well in social rights in general. But it struck me because it was Daddy-Daughter Day in a way. It was the picture of the two of you. Has this elevated sense of activism and her being at an age where she is primed to become a young leader in a very meaningful way, does that add a different coloring for you to what it means to be an advocate, the fact that now you can be side by side with your daughter and supporting efforts of hers as well?
Absolutely. In our house, we're very politically aware and involved. And in the days preceding the march, my daughter kept complaining that few of her friends wanted to go with her. After all, we live in a very conservative part of our country. And so she asked me if I would go with her, and I didn't want to at the beginning, feeling lazy. And that day we decided to go. And when we got out of the car, I first thought I made a mistake. I saw 25,000 angry women, and my first impulse was to run. But
That's fair.
I stayed, and I had one of the most magical days of my daughter's life and mine together. And ever since that day, we speak on the phone or we text each other every day. And we keep saying that for women, as for people with pre-existing conditions, for every vulnerable part of our society, we have to keep in mind this mantra that is often repeated on social media. Yes, we will be warned. Yes, we will be given explanations. And yes, we must persist. We must persist until we get what we need, because what we need is fair. My son's fracture is frequently shipped to my office because there's always somebody here to receive it. And even though I speak to my office colleagues about how expensive his medication is, when that little box comes into my office and I tell them this is how much he's going to use in the next 6 weeks, and it costs $60,000-$70,000, that drives the picture of what we face. If lifetime caps come back, our community cannot deal with that. If they go back to very low lifetime caps, we will run through them in a year. So that is not a choice. And we have to educate our representatives. We have to tell them that what these things that they're thinking about will not work. I have seen that in Paul Ryan's plan, for example, he's suggesting funding the high-risk pools with $2.5 billion a year for everybody.
Yeah, it's not going to cut it.
That's not going to cut it even for the few thousand of us who have bleeding disorders.
Mm-mm.
We cannot be placed in that position. We cannot fight after changes happen. We have to fight before the changes happen. And the way to fight is with education, with telling our story, sharing with our elected officials how it is that we get our medication, and the cost of the alternative. If we do not get our fracture, we didn't save money. We will spend many times more in the repercussions of not having fracture.
And we'll be put into a state, as I have said many times on this podcast, the difference between us and people with hemophilia who live in parts in the developing world, and really 75%, the vast majority of our global community, the difference between our outlook and their outlook is the access to product and the ability to take it on an optimized regimen. That's the difference between a life expectancy that's on par with our peers and the general population and a life expectancy of less than 10 years old. So there's the incredible costs assumed with poor treatment and hospitalizations, unnecessary hospitalizations, preventable hospitalizations. There's the human quality of life cost of what it means to just be living in the hospital or living on the couch, treating bleeds because you can't be treating yourself proactively, prophylactically. But then there's the human life cost, and there's not a price tag that you can put on that. So we have a very compelling argument to make, and the important part is, as you've stated very clearly, that we are making it and that we are making it before decisions get made. So with that, maybe just to kind of bring us to a close here, can you speak a little bit more about Washington Days, which is coming up soon, happens every year, but this year it just feels particularly important. So talk a little bit about Washington Days and why people should attend.
Absolutely. Since we had a change in the last election, a lot of people are discussing the possibility of changing our insurance and our healthcare access. In March 8th through 10th of this year, we have the opportunity to come together in Washington and go talk to our legislators in person. And there will be a record assistance this year. But for anybody who's listening, do not be discouraged if you cannot go to Washington. Your congressman, your senator has an office where you live. If you live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or if you live in Riverside, California, or you live in Miami, your congressman has an office right there. You can go visit them. You can talk to his aide, and many times you can talk to her or to him and introduce yourself. Tell them that you are one of their constituents and tell them about how you're affected by your bleeding disorder, whether it's hemophilia or von Willebrand's disease or any other bleeding disorder. And tell them how you're concerned about losing our access to care. Tell them how lifetime caps would affect you. Tell them how pre-existing conditions would affect you. Mention problems that we currently have, but focus on getting them to listen to how changing what we have right now can be very dangerous for our community. Most of the people, if not all of them, who are in those offices are there because they care, because they want to make positive changes. In every case, they are human beings, and what they're trying to do is what they think is best for us. if we are able to educate them to our needs, to our concerns, to our plight, to our pain, little by little, and in the aggregate, we will make a difference.
And we'll have links in the program notes for more information on Washington Days and how you can get involved, as well as links that may help you if you can't attend Washington Days or in general want to know what you can do from home or on a more regular basis. Again, we'll have links in the program notes that you can follow. Jorge, thank you so much for appearing on BloodStream today and for the insights and for sharing about your family story. It's wonderful to have you on, and we'll have you back again at some other point.
Patrick, you are a bright light in our community. I look at you with admiration, and I know that it is because of young men like you that we will have a really bright future. Thank you for everything that you do for us.
Well, thank you for saying that, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you, Patrick.
That was a great sit-down segment with Jorge.
I thought so. I thought that went very well.
Yeah. I can't get the image of him carrying his son around in a pillow, this little baby.
I know.
And going from that to being a respected leader in the community.
Quite a journey.
Yeah, an absolute journey.
And now, his son's involved in the community. His daughter is very active within the community. So it's also trickled to his kids as well. But, it's funny. I remember, what was it, December, just after around Christmas, I held the youngest baby I'd ever held. It was like 18 hours old or something. And the amount of anxiety I had about I could break this thing. I'm going to do damage to it inevitably.
Yeah. And you weren't just told that baby had a chronic condition that, you knew very little about. So, yeah, parents of any new infant are going to have that anxiety. Couple that with more health information.
But, as we were actually for the Ask the Expert podcast, we had a pediatric hematologist, Arash Mahajaran, on the first episode, and he and I were talking off mic about, the anxieties that new parents face. And I'm reminded of the addiction and hemophilia piece from earlier in the pod, and that idea of you are not alone. I think it sounds as though pediatric hematologists, at least from Arash's perspective, really try to emphasize that upon early diagnosis, that, hey, you're not alone. There's a community of people. It's going to sound scary now, but we know the resources that you will need. We can point you toward those, and you're going to be an expert on this in no time.
And Jorge said that, too. As soon as he saw other children in the community playing and adults in the community who were living successful lives, it quelled his anxieties.
Exactly. All right, and just before we bring this home, parting shots. One last top-of-mind thought from Natalie and I to leave you with for the month of February. Natalie, putting you on the spot for a parting shot first. What do you got?
My parting shot is that I'm having a hankering for these Dutch caramel waffles that I cannot stop buying, or eating for that matter.
Yeah, I can attest to this. This is confirmed.
If you have never tried a Dutch caramel waffle, you should go out and do it.
Actually, it sounds like maybe you shouldn't. It sounds like it can become a problem.
Yeah. What's your parting shot, Patrick?
My parting shot is that tomorrow, we're recording this Wednesday the 15th, so a few days ahead of when it comes out on Monday the 20th. And tomorrow on Thursday the 16th, Elsewhere, which is the first movie I ever executively produced and directed, is having its world premiere in a festival here in Los Angeles, and we've actually already won one and are nominated for another award for the movie, and I'm really proud of that. I never anticipated being a director of any kind, and now I do a lot of directing, but I certainly didn't even anticipate directing a feature film until basically 2 years ago when I somewhat impulsively made that commitment to the screenwriter if he would let us move forward. So very cool to see it go from that conversation to tomorrow, big screen, LA premiere. And it's nice to see how much of the community is interested in that. I've gotten a lot of nice comments and supportive words from people in this community. And when we do programs like this or things that are specific for the bleeding disorders community, I anticipate a certain amount of that. But it's really been just nice to see how much support there's been for this film, this piece of entertainment that I helped shepherd into the world. And I like that the community feels connected to it through me, and that people that I know in the community feel like they're a part of this. And actually, there are members of the bleeding disorders community in this movie. We needed every pair of hands we could find in Los Angeles, so there is also that. But I guess thank you to anybody who has said a nice thing about Elsewhere. I appreciate that, and I hope you get a chance to see the film, and I hope I can keep doing stuff that you think is cool, because I find it fun, and I like that it benefits people beyond me within this community. How's that for a parting shot?
It's a great parting shot. I'm excited for tomorrow night.
Yeah, it should be fun. I guess we'll have to give people an update about it next month. And that is all for this episode. Don't forget to check out BloodStreamMedia.com and to subscribe to the Ask the Expert and Powering Through podcast series to hear all of BloodStream Media's podcasts for the bleeding disorders community. Have a question for Ask the Expert or an idea for a future episode of BloodStream? Email us at mailbag@bloodstreammedia.com. You can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/BloodStreamMedia, and on Twitter @BloodStreamInfo. This episode of BloodStream was written by Patrick James Lynch and Natalie DeLillo and edited by Ryan Gielen. Produced by Patrick James Lynch, Ryan Gielen, Rob Bradford, Andrew Gall, Josh Bragg, Avra Friedman, and Colby Crow. And the BloodStream podcast is edited by Mr. Andrew Gall. Special thanks to everybody at Believe Limited, the National Hemophilia Foundation, our presenting sponsor, Shire, our supporting sponsor, Stop the Bleeding, the Hemophilia Alliance, and special thanks as well to our sit-down guest, Jorge de la Riva, and to our anonymous mom, a nano-mom, if you will, for that compelling story on addiction. Thank you so much for sharing. Reminder to check out the program notes for this episode in your podcast player of choice or on bloodstreampod.com for links and additional information about the various stories featured on this episode. My name is Patrick James Lynch.
And I'm Natalie DeLillo.
And until next time, take self-care of yourself.